My name is Harper Quinn and I'm 36. If you met me in passing, you'd probably file me away as pleasant and move on. I'm not the kind of woman who performs confidence in public. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice to be counted. I've spent most of my adult life doing work that rewards the opposite: quiet precision, long attention, and the ability to stay calm while other people rush. People often mistake calm for softness. In my marriage, it became a convenient story. Harper is steady, Harper is agreeable, Harper doesn't need much, Harper will handle the small stuff so everyone else can focus on what matters. The strange thing about being dependable is that people start treating your contribution like it's part of the furniture, useful, invisible, and assumed to be there forever. And then one day, you hear yourself reduced to a sentence. Not in a fight, not in a dramatic showdown, in a room where words are recorded and weighed. My husband told the court, "I contributed nothing to our marriage." It sounds like something that would make a woman explode. But this story isn't about shouting, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't about humiliating anyone in front of a judge. It's about something quieter. What happens when the person everyone underestimated finally has to speak in a place where facts matter more than charisma? During our divorce hearing, he claimed I was financially useless. The judge's next question completely changed the tone of the courtroom. Over the next 15 parts, I'm going to tell you how we got there. The slow shaping of a role I didn't choose, the small dismissals that trained everyone to overlook me, the moment I realized my marriage had been rewritten without my consent, and the calm steps I took once I understood what was actually true on paper. There are no cartoon villains here. My husband wasn't cruel every day. His mother didn't twirl a metaphorical moustache. This was more subtle than that, polite, reasonable sounding, and therefore easy for others to excuse, until the structure of it all finally met a system that doesn't run on assumptions. I'll tell you what I did, what I didn't do, and why. I'll tell you what it cost me emotionally, and I'll tell you what it taught me about quiet power, especially the kind that doesn't announce itself until it has to. So before I begin properly, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever watched people decide who you are, simply because you didn't fight to correct them? If you had asked my husband, Daniel, to describe me during the first years of our marriage, he probably would have smiled and said something simple. "Harper keeps everything running." He meant it as a compliment. Daniel was the kind of man people noticed in a room. Confident voice, easy humor, the ability to tell a story that made strangers lean closer. At dinner parties, he was the one who filled silences and made waiters laugh. People liked being around him. I was the one who noticed when someone's glass was empty. That difference never felt like a problem at first. When we met, I actually liked how easily Daniel moved through social spaces that exhausted me. I preferred listening, observing, letting conversations unfold without needing to steer them. Daniel often told friends that I was the calmest person he knew. "Nothing rattles her," he'd say proudly. And in the early years, that description felt fair. I worked in payroll compliance for a regional logistics firm in Bristol. My job required patience, attention to detail, and a tolerance for reading documents most people would abandon after the first paragraph. I handled employee records, financial reporting, tax structures, the quiet machinery that keeps businesses running. Daniel, meanwhile, worked in property development. His world moved faster. Meetings, investors, construction sites, negotiations. He liked decisions that felt big and visible. I liked systems that worked quietly in the background. Together, from the outside, we looked balanced. Friends described us that way all the time. "Daniel's the energy," someone once joked during a dinner with friends. "Harper's the stability." Everyone laughed, including me, because at that point, stability still sounded like a strength. Our marriage followed a rhythm that made sense for both of us. Daniel worked longer hours and often came home with stories about projects his company was pursuing. I listened, asked thoughtful questions, and sometimes helped him review numbers or timelines when he felt stuck. He appreciated that, at least at first. "Your brain works like a spreadsheet," he once told me with a grin. "I don't know how you keep track of all these details." But gradually, the way people described my role shifted. Not dramatically, just subtly. When Daniel's parents visited, his mother would compliment how orderly the house looked. "You've made such a peaceful home here, Harper," she'd say warmly. Then she'd turn to Daniel and ask about property investments, mortgage rates, and neighborhood development plans. At gatherings with friends, Daniel's career became the centerpiece of conversation. What's the next project? Are you expanding outside the city? How many units are you building now? If someone asked about my work, the conversation usually ended quickly. Oh, Harper works with payroll and compliance, Daniel would explain casually. People nodded politely. Then the focus returned to him. Again, none of this felt hostile, just structured. Daniel was the builder. I was the one who organized life around the building. I scheduled maintenance appointments for the house. I handled tax paperwork each spring. I kept track of insurance renewals and council notices that arrived in the mail. Small things. Administrative things. The kind of tasks people appreciate but rarely think about once they're done. Daniel sometimes joked about it with friends. Honestly, Harper could probably run our entire life without me noticing. He laughed once. Everyone chuckled. It sounded affectionate. But underneath that comment lived an assumption that would grow more important later. Daniel's work created life. My work maintained it. And because I rarely corrected that narrative, it slowly became the version of reality everyone believed, including Daniel, including his family, and if I'm being honest, for a long time, including me. Because when people repeat a description of you often enough, it starts to feel easier to inhabit that role than to challenge it. The organized one, the calm one, the supportive one, the one who keeps things running quietly in the background. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't understand then. Roles like that feel comfortable until the day someone decides that being supportive means you didn't actually build anything at all. And once that idea takes root, it becomes surprisingly easy for others to believe it. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. If someone had asked me that evening whether anything unusual had happened, I probably would have said no. But memory has a way of highlighting small details after you understand what they meant. It happened about 4 years into our marriage. Daniel and I had just finished dinner at a restaurant near the harbour. It was one of those quiet places with dim lighting and soft music, the kind of restaurant couples visit when they want a calm evening rather than a celebration. We were meeting his parents. His mother, Lorraine, had chosen the place. She arrived early, already seated at the table with a glass of wine, scanning the menu like she had been there many times before. Lorraine was always polite, always well-dressed, always warm in a way that made it difficult to challenge anything she said without feeling unreasonable. She greeted me with a hug. "Harper, you look lovely," she said. Then she turned to Daniel with the kind of proud smile mothers reserve for sons they believe have done well in life. During dinner, the conversation followed a predictable pattern. Lorraine asked Daniel about his newest development project. "How many units will this one have?" she asked. 22, Daniel said, "if the permits go through next month." "That's wonderful," she said, clearly impressed. They spoke about zoning regulations, contractor bids, and property values rising in certain neighborhoods. I listened quietly while finishing my meal. At some point, Lorraine glanced toward me and smiled. "And Harper," she said kindly, "how is work going?" "Busy," I replied. "End of quarter reporting." She nodded politely. "Numbers and paperwork," she said. Then she turned back to Daniel. "So have you thought about whether this next project could become a rental property later?" The shift was so smooth that no one else noticed it. But I did. Not because the comment was insulting. It wasn't. It was simply dismissive in a very particular way. Numbers and paperwork, as if that's where my world began and ended. The rest of the dinner continued the same way. Daniel described investment structures. Lorraine asked questions about financing. They spoke about long-term property strategies, like two people discussing something that belonged naturally to both of them. I sipped my wine and listened. Occasionally, Daniel would glance at me and smile, as if to include me in the warmth of the conversation, without actually inviting my thoughts. On the drive home that night, Daniel seemed relaxed. "That went well," he said casually. "Your mum seemed excited about the project." "She likes hearing about property," I replied. Daniel nodded. "She's always been good with those. I watched the streetlights passing outside the window. Then I said something simple. "You know I work with financial structures too, right?" Daniel laughed lightly. "Of course you do." His tone carried no malice, just dismissal. "Your stuff is different though," he added. "How?" "Well, you know," he said with a shrug. "Internal business numbers, payroll things, not really an investment strategy." The sentence hung quietly in the car for a moment. Again, nothing about his tone suggested cruelty, just certainty, a belief about how the world was organized. Daniel dealt with assets and growth. I dealt with administration. Two different worlds. When we arrived home, Daniel unlocked the door and walked inside without noticing that I had paused briefly on the porch. For the first time, I realized something small but important. The people closest to me didn't actually understand what I did for a living. Not fully. And more importantly, they had never felt the need to ask. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a conversation, just a small moment at dinner. But something about it stayed with me long after the evening ended. Not as anger, not even as hurt, just as a quiet observation. Because once someone reduces your expertise to numbers and paperwork, it becomes easier for them to believe your contributions never extend beyond that. And once that belief settles in, it tends to show up again, in ways that feel just as small, but carry a little more weight each time. After that dinner with Lorraine, nothing dramatic changed. Daniel didn't suddenly become dismissive. Lorraine didn't begin treating me badly. Life continued the way it always had. Quiet mornings, busy work days, dinners together in the evening. Which is exactly why the pattern took so long to fully reveal itself. Because the moments that followed never felt large enough to challenge on their own. They were always small, reasonable, easy to excuse. A few months after that dinner, Daniel invited two colleagues over for drinks one Friday evening. They worked with him in property development. Men who liked discussing market trends the way sports fans discuss team statistics. I prepared a few snacks, set out glasses, and joined them in the living room. At first, the conversation was light. Weekend plans, recent football matches, and a joke about the construction delays Daniel's company had dealt with earlier that month. Then one of his colleagues asked a question. So how did you structure the financing on the Eastbrook site? Daniel leaned forward, clearly enjoying the topic. He began explaining the layered investment structure, private equity mixed with bank financing, and phased construction schedules. I listened quietly, because I recognized the framework immediately. It wasn't unusual. It was actually quite similar to financial models I had reviewed during compliance audits at work. Without thinking too much about it, I added a small comment. Did you stagger the funding release based on the permit approvals? I asked. All three men looked at me. Daniel blinked once, slightly surprised. Yeah, he said slowly. That's smart, I said. It reduces the lender's risk exposure if the permits get delayed. There was a short pause. Not uncomfortable, just unexpected. Then Daniel chuckled. See? He said to his colleagues. Harper listens to all my work stories whether she wants to or not. Everyone laughed, and the conversation moved on. No one asked a follow-up question. No one seemed curious about how I recognized the financing structure so quickly. The moment simply disappeared into the evening. Later, after his colleagues left, Daniel wrapped his arms around me in the kitchen while I was putting away the dishes. You were quiet tonight, he said. I spoke a little, I replied. He smiled. You always do that, he said. What? Slip in one smart observation and then disappear again. His tone was affectionate, but what he said next revealed something deeper. You'd hate working in my field, he added. Too many big personalities. I dried the last plate and placed it in the cabinet. Maybe, I said. The truth was, I didn't hate big personalities. I simply didn't feel the need to compete with them. Still, the pattern kept repeating. At family gatherings, Lorraine continued discussing financial matters with Daniel while I sat nearby. When bank letters arrived in the mail, Daniel often skimmed them quickly before setting them aside. If there's anything complicated, you'll notice it, he'd say casually. It sounded like trust, but it also meant the decisions were already made before I read the documents. Gradually, something subtle began happening inside my own thinking. I started explaining their behavior to myself. Daniel doesn't mean to dismiss you. Lorraine is just used to talking with her son. It's easier not to make things awkward. That sentence became a quiet habit. It's easier not to make things awkward. So I stayed calm, stayed cooperative, stayed exactly the version of myself everyone expected. Because harmony felt more valuable than correcting every small misunderstanding. But normalization has a strange effect over time. The more often something happens without challenge, the more natural it begins to feel for everyone involved, including the people benefiting from it. By the time Daniel and I reached our 9th year of marriage, the pattern had fully settled into place. Daniel handled the big decisions. I handled the details. And because details rarely draw attention, my role became something people relied on without really seeing. Looking back now, I understand something important. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly through a series of moments so small that correcting them feels unnecessary. Until one day, those small moments form a structure that defines exactly how much your contribution is believed to matter. And by then, everyone has already become comfortable with it. By the 10th year of our marriage, the role everyone expected me to play had become so familiar that no one ever questioned it anymore. Not Daniel, not Lorraine, and for a long time, not even me. If someone asked what I contributed to our life together, the answer always sounded the same. Harper keeps everything organized. Harper makes life run smoothly. Harper handles the details. None of those statements was wrong, but they described a function, not a person. I managed our household finances in the quietest way possible. Bills were paid early. Tax records were neatly filed each year. Insurance policies never lapsed. When council letters arrived in the mail, I read them carefully and placed reminders on our calendar. Daniel appreciated that, but appreciation isn't the same as recognition. To him, and gradually to everyone else, my role became something practical rather than meaningful. A system that existed in the background. Daniel once said something during a dinner with friends that perfectly captured how people saw me. We were sitting around a long table in a small Italian restaurant. Someone had asked Daniel how he managed to balance multiple development projects at once. He laughed. Honestly, Harper keeps the rest of my life from falling apart, he said. If I had to remember half the administrative stuff she does, nothing would ever get finished. Everyone smiled. One of his friends lifted his glass toward me. Every successful man needs a Harper, he joked. I smiled politely and lifted my own glass in return, because technically it sounded like praise, but there was an assumption hidden inside that compliment. Daniel built things. I maintained them. His work created value. Mine simply prevented problems. The difference may seem small when you say it quickly, but when people repeat that dynamic over and over again, it becomes the structure everyone starts believing. Lorraine reinforced that structure in subtle ways. Whenever she visited our house, she always complimented the same things. The kitchen looks so tidy. You've made the living room feel so comfortable. You're wonderful at creating a peaceful home. Then she would sit with Daniel at the dining table and ask questions about property markets, development permits, or investment strategies. Sometimes I was sitting right beside them while those conversations happened, but the questions were never directed at me. Even though I was the one who actually read our mortgage statements when they arrived, even though I handled the spreadsheets tracking our household finances. For years, I assumed Lorraine simply didn't realize. But over time, I began noticing something deeper. She had a very clear belief about how families worked. In her mind, stability came from defined roles. The son handled assets. The wife ensured the home remained calm. It wasn't something she ever said out loud as a rule. It was simply the structure she believed in. And Daniel had grown comfortable inside that structure. One evening, about a year before everything changed, Daniel mentioned something while we were sitting on the sofa after dinner. Mum thinks we should eventually restructure the house ownership, he said casually. I looked up from the book in my hands. What kind of restructuring? He shrugged. Just long-term planning, protecting the property for the future. The phrase sounded vague. Protecting it from a war. I studied. Daniel smiled, the same easy smile he used whenever he thought I might be overthinking something. You worry about details more than anyone I know, he said. Then he added something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Mum understands these things better than most people. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I felt angry, but because I realized something quietly important. When Daniel thought about financial decisions involving our home, two people existed in that conversation. His mother and himself. My expertise, the work I did every day analyzing financial systems, simply wasn't part of that equation. Not because Daniel intended to exclude me, but because the role everyone had assigned me didn't include being a decision maker. I was the organizer, the stabilizer, the quiet support system. And once people become comfortable with a certain version of you, they stop wondering whether there might be more to see. The moment things began to shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no shocking discovery that immediately changed everything. It happened on a completely ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that usually disappears from memory. It was a Sunday in early October. The air had that quiet coolness that signals the beginning of autumn, and sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen windows while I was making tea. Daniel walked in holding a folded document. "Quick thing," he said casually, placing the paper on the dining table. His tone carried the relaxed confidence of someone presenting something routine. I dried my hands on a towel and looked down at the paper. "What is it?" I asked. "Just a property form," Daniel replied. "Something administrative." I felt a small flicker of curiosity. "What kind of property form?" Daniel shrugged. "Mum suggested we update part of the title record," he said. "Apparently it simplifies things later on." The mention of Lorraine didn't alarm me at first. She had always been interested in property planning, inheritance structures, asset protection, things like that. So I picked up the document and started reading. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter while scrolling through his phone, completely relaxed. At first, the language looked like typical legal wording: administrative title update, ownership reference adjustment, future beneficiary notation. Nothing immediately alarming, but something about the phrasing made me slow down. Years of working with compliance documents had trained my brain to notice patterns in language. Legal text often hides its most important meaning inside sentences that appear ordinary. I read the second page more carefully, then the third. "What solicitor drafted this?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked up from his phone. "Mum's friend recommended someone," he said. "Why?" I glanced back down at the document. Technically, the form wasn't transferring ownership of the house directly. Not yet. But it introduced a legal clause allowing an alternative title holder to be registered under specific circumstances. Circumstances that were described in language vague enough that most people would skim past them. "Did the solicitor explain what this section means?" I asked, tapping one paragraph. Daniel walked over and looked at the page briefly. He read about 2 sentences before waving a hand dismissively. "It's just legal wording," he said. "They always make these things sound more complicated than they are." His tone wasn't irritated, just confident. The confidence of someone who believed the situation was simple. "You're better with paperwork than I am," he added casually. "If there's anything weird, you'll spot it." Then he stepped away from the table and poured himself a glass of water. For a moment, I continued reading. The clause wasn't illegal. It wasn't even particularly unusual in estate planning, but it was strategic. Strategic in a way that suggested the person who drafted it understood property structures very well. I set the document back on the table. Daniel returned a few seconds later with a pen. "So it's fine, right?" he asked. I looked at him. He seemed relaxed, completely unconcerned. And suddenly, I understood something important about the moment we were standing in. Daniel believed this document was harmless. He believed Lorraine had arranged something simple. And most importantly, he believed I would glance over it quickly and confirm that everything was normal. For a few seconds, I considered explaining the clause. I could have pointed out the implications. I could have suggested speaking directly with the solicitor before signing anything. But instead, I simply placed the document back where it had been. "It looks administrative!" Daniel smiled, relieved. "I told you," he said lightly. He signed the form a few minutes later. The pen moved across the paper with the easy confidence of someone completing a routine task. Then he folded the document and set it aside to mail the next morning. The moment lasted less than 10 minutes. But that night, lying awake beside him in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, I replayed the wording of that clause in my mind. Not with anger, not with suspicion, just with the careful attention I usually reserved for complex contracts at work. Because something about that document had revealed a small but important truth. Daniel had been perfectly comfortable signing a property-related document without fully understanding what it meant, and everyone involved, including his mother, seemed equally comfortable with that. What none of them noticed was that while Daniel signed the paper quickly, I had already begun remembering every detail. And sometimes, remembering the details is the first step toward understanding a much larger picture. When people imagine turning points in a story, they usually picture a dramatic reaction, an argument, a confrontation, a demand for explanation. But that's not what happened after Daniel signed that document. From the outside, nothing changed at all. Monday arrived the way it always did. I woke before Daniel, made coffee, and left for work, while the early morning streets of Bristol were still quiet. My day at the office followed its usual rhythm. Emails, payroll reports, compliance checks. But something inside my thinking had shifted. Not loudly, just deliberately. For the first time, silence stopped being automatic. It became a choice. The difference between those two things is subtle, but important. Before that Sunday, I had stayed quiet because harmony felt easier than questioning every small decision. After that Sunday, I stayed quiet because I wanted time to understand what had actually been set in motion. And understanding requires observation. Over the next several weeks, Daniel continued behaving exactly as he always had. Occasionally, he mentioned conversations with Lorraine about future planning. Sometimes he brought home documents that he skimmed quickly before setting them aside. Whenever he handed something to me and said, "Can you glance over this later?" I did, carefully, without commentary. And because I had spent years cultivating the role of the calm, cooperative partner, my silence never raised suspicion. If anything, it reassured them. Daniel believed everything was proceeding smoothly. Lorraine likely believed the structure she had suggested was already in place. Neither of them noticed that my attention had become much sharper. I started doing something I often did at work when reviewing complex files, building a quiet timeline. Not physically at first, just mentally. The date we purchased the house, the original mortgage agreement, the document Daniel had signed that Sunday, the way Lorraine spoke about protecting the property for the future. Each piece on its own looked ordinary. But when you place ordinary pieces next to each other, patterns begin to appear. One evening, about 2 weeks after the document had been mailed, a letter arrived from the property registry, confirming that the title record had been updated. Daniel skimmed it while standing in the kitchen. "Looks like it went through," he said casually. I took the letter and read it more carefully. The wording confirmed something subtle but significant. An additional name had been registered on the property title, Lorraine's, not as the sole owner, but as a recognized title holder. Daniel seemed satisfied. "Mum said this would make inheritance simpler later," he said. I nodded slightly. From his perspective, the situation was straightforward. The house now included Lorraine's name as part of its legal structure. But the moment I finished reading the letter, another document surfaced in my memory. The mortgage agreement. Because houses don't exist in isolation. When a property is purchased with a mortgage, the lender becomes part of that structure. And lenders care deeply about how the collateral securing their loans is legally defined. That thought stayed quietly in the back of my mind. Not urgent, just present. Over the next few days, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't question Lorraine. Instead, I did what I always did when something required careful attention. I gathered information. One evening after Daniel went to bed, I opened the cabinet where we kept important paperwork and pulled out the blue folder labeled House Documents. Inside were copies of everything: the purchase agreement, insurance records, tax filings, and the original mortgage contract. I carried the folder to the dining table and began reading, slowly, page by page. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft glow through the living room windows, while the rest of the house remained silent. And as I moved through the mortgage contract, a quiet realization began forming. The situation Daniel believed had been resolved might not actually be resolved at all. But I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't react emotionally, because silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space for something powerful. Clarity. And clarity was exactly what I intended to find before anyone else realized there was something to clarify. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There were no secret phone calls in the middle of the night. No whispered conversations behind closed doors. No sudden changes in how I behaved at home. If someone had watched my life during the weeks that followed, they would have seen exactly the same routines that had existed for years. Work, dinner, quiet evenings. Daniel continued leaving for work each morning with the same quick kiss on the cheek. Lorraine still called occasionally to ask about weekend plans. Friends still invited us to dinner. The rhythm of our life appeared completely unchanged. And that was intentional, because while nothing about my behavior shifted, my attention had become much more precise. At work, one of the first lessons I learned in compliance analysis was this: the truth of a situation rarely exists in a single document. It exists across many documents, across dates, across small pieces of language that only begin to make sense when you place them next to each other. So that's what I started doing. Every evening after Daniel went upstairs to bed, I spent 20 or 30 minutes sitting at the dining table with the blue folder of house documents open in front of me. The same way I would review a file at work, methodically, without emotion. The first step was building a timeline. The date Daniel and I purchased the house, the signing of the mortgage agreement, the administrative title form that Daniel had signed that Sunday afternoon, and finally, the property registry confirmation showing Lorraine's name had been added to the title. On their own, none of these events was unusual, but when placed together, they formed a structure that deserved careful examination. The mortgage agreement became the center of my attention. Not the summary letter we occasionally received from the bank. The full contract. 47 pages of legal language that most people would never voluntarily read more than once in their lifetime. For me, documents like that felt almost familiar, because, unlike conversations, contracts don't rely on assumptions. They rely on wording, and wording reveals structure. I reread the agreement slowly over several evenings, occasionally highlighting sections that connected to property ownership or borrower obligations. The key detail appeared early in the document. The mortgage had been approved for 2 borrowers, Daniel and me. That alone wasn't unusual. Many couples take out mortgages together. But what mattered was how the contract defined the property itself. The house wasn't simply ours. It was collateral attached to a loan structure. And that structure described very specific conditions about how the property could legally exist while the mortgage remained active. One clause in particular caught my attention. It addressed unauthorized title transfers. The language was careful, almost understated, but the meaning was clear. If the legal ownership of the property changed without the lender's formal approval, the mortgage could be considered in breach of its conditions. Not immediately catastrophic, but serious enough that the lender could demand clarification, restructuring, or reassessment of the loan. I read that paragraph several times. Then I closed the folder and sat quietly for a moment, because what I was seeing didn't feel like a loophole. It felt like structure. Daniel and Lorraine had approached the house as if ownership could be rearranged privately, like adjusting names on a family record. But the mortgage meant the property existed inside a much larger legal system. A system that wasn't consulted when the title changed. The more I thought about it, the clearer something else became. Neither Daniel nor Lorraine had actually read the mortgage agreement in full. They had relied on explanations, on summaries, on the comfortable belief that legal documents usually say what people expect them to say. But documents don't work that way. They say exactly what they were written to say, and sometimes those meanings only become visible to the person willing to read them carefully. Over the following week, I continued gathering small pieces of information. Copies of the property title record, recent bank correspondence, insurance documentation connected to the house. I organized everything neatly into a second folder, not because I expected conflict, but clarity matters. If a situation eventually reaches a point where explanations are required, and something inside me had begun to understand that this situation might eventually reach that point. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Daniel continued talking about his work projects each evening while we ate dinner. Lorraine occasionally mentioned how relieved she felt knowing the house was properly arranged for the future. Each time she said that, I simply nodded. Because the truth was this: they believed the structure of the house had already been finalized, but the documents suggested something different, something incomplete. And the interesting thing about incomplete legal structures is that, eventually, someone notices. Often not the people who created them, but the systems are designed to enforce them. By the time that realization fully settled in my mind, one thing had become very clear. Daniel and Lorraine had built their plan on an assumption. I was quietly beginning to understand where that assumption might fail. The moment of full clarity didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, through a series of quiet confirmations that gradually connected everything I had been reading. About 3 weeks after I began reviewing the documents, I took a lunch break and walked to a small cafe a few streets away from my office. It was a place I visited occasionally when I needed uninterrupted time to think. That afternoon I brought something with me. A printed copy of the mortgage agreement. Not the summary, the full document. 47 pages of dense legal language most people would never read voluntarily outside a law office. But that day, I wanted to read one section again, with complete focus. I ordered tea, sat near the window, and opened the contract to the clause that had caught my attention several evenings earlier. Borrower obligations and property title integrity. The heading itself was neutral, almost boring, but the paragraph underneath it contained a sentence that quietly reshaped the entire situation. The mortgage defined the property as collateral attached specifically to the original borrower configuration listed in the loan approval. 2 names, Daniel Quinn, Harper Quinn. The contract then described what would happen if the legal title of the property changed while the mortgage remained active. Any change in ownership requires formal lender approval, not an informal notification. Approval. Without that approval, the lender reserved the right to review the mortgage conditions, reassess the loan risk, or demand immediate restructuring of the agreement. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time, outside the cafe window, pedestrians passed by in the steady rhythm of an ordinary weekday afternoon. People carrying coffee cups, someone walking a dog. A delivery van stops briefly at the corner. The normal movement of life continued around me, while something much quieter settled inside my mind. Because in that moment, the entire structure became clear. Daniel believed the house ownership had been adjusted successfully. Lorraine almost certainly believed the same thing. The property registry had accepted the title update. On paper, her name now appeared as part of the ownership record. But the mortgage existed as a separate legal structure, and that structure still recognized the house according to the original borrower agreement. Daniel and me. Which meant something important. The house could not simply become Lorraine's asset, while the mortgage continued operating under Daniel and me as borrowers. The lender still had authority over how the property legally existed as collateral, and that authority had never been consulted when the title was changed. I closed the document and sat quietly for a moment. The feeling that followed wasn't triumph. It wasn't anger. It was something calmer, clarity, because the leverage in this situation wasn't something I had created. It had existed from the very beginning, written inside a contract that Daniel and I had signed years earlier. The only difference now was that I had taken the time to read it carefully. I finished my tea, folded the papers neatly back into my bag, and returned to the office. That evening, Daniel mentioned something casually while we were eating dinner. "Mum says the property title update is finally done," he said. "Everything's sorted now." I looked up from my plate. "That must be a relief for her," I replied. Daniel nodded. "She likes having things organized." The sentence almost made me smile, because what Daniel didn't realize was that the structure he believed was finalized still depended on a system that hadn't yet been addressed. The lender. And lenders pay attention to collateral structures. Eventually, that night, after Daniel went upstairs, I opened the property folder again. This time I created something new. A written timeline. Purchase date of the house. Mortgage approval. Title adjustment filing. Property registry confirmation. And finally, the clause in the mortgage describing the lender's authority over ownership changes. When the pieces were placed together on paper, the pattern became unmistakable. Daniel and Lorraine believed they had completed a transfer, but legally the structure remained unresolved. And unless the mortgage itself was restructured, a process that would require my participation, the house could never fully exist in the forms they believed it did. I placed the timeline into the folder and closed it carefully. Because the most interesting part of this discovery wasn't the legal detail itself. It was the position it created. I now understand something neither Daniel nor Lorraine realized. The situation they believed was finished had only just begun. And for the first time since this story started unfolding, a new question appeared in my mind. Not what had happened, but what I intended to do with the knowledge I now had. Once you fully understand a situation, the next step is rarely immediate action. First comes something quieter. A decision about what kind of person you want to be when everything settles. For several days after the realization in that cafe, I did nothing at all. At least nothing visible. Life at home continued exactly as it always had. Daniel still talked about work during dinner. Lorraine still called occasionally to ask how we were doing. Friends still invited us out for drinks on weekends. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, my thinking had shifted into a different place. Because the question in front of me wasn't whether I had leverage. The documents had already answered that. The real question was what I intended to do with it. There were several possible paths. The first was confrontation. I could have placed the mortgage contract on the dining table one evening and asked Daniel a direct question. Why did you believe the house could be transferred without restructuring the loan? I could have explained the clause, walked him through the implications, forced the entire situation into the open. That approach would have been honest, but it would also have given away something important. The fact that I understood the structure of the situation before he did. Another option was escalation. I could have contacted a solicitor immediately and challenged the title adjustment through legal channels. The argument would have been simple. The property had been altered without a full understanding of the existing mortgage conditions. That route might have produced quick results, but it would also have transformed the situation into a conflict before I fully understood how far Daniel and Lorraine had already gone with their assumptions. And conflict has a way of becoming louder than the truth. There was a third option, the quietest one. Patience. Allow the situation to move forward naturally until the contradictions inside it reached the systems that enforce legal structures. Because mortgages are not private family agreements. They are contracts. And contracts operate on rules that eventually demand alignment with reality. For nearly 2 weeks, I lived inside that decision. I didn't raise the topic. I didn't hint that anything might be wrong. Instead, I watched. Daniel occasionally mentioned conversations with Lorraine about finalizing the house structure. His tone carried the relaxed confidence of someone who believed everything was already under control. "Mum just wants everything organized for the future," he said one evening. I nodded. Organized for the future. The irony of that sentence didn't escape me, because the future he imagined depended on a legal structure that hadn't actually been resolved. And eventually, someone would have to resolve it. The bank, a solicitor. A compliance review was triggered by routine registry checks. At some point, the system surrounding that mortgage would notice the mismatch. One quiet evening, after Daniel had gone upstairs to bed, I opened the mortgage contract again and looked at the borrower section. 2 names, Daniel Quinn, Harper Quinn. That was when the decision finally settled. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to accuse anyone of deception. And I wasn't going to warn them that their plan might not work the way they believed. Instead, I would do something much simpler. I would allow the structure of the contract to reveal itself when the time came, because sometimes the most irreversible decisions are the quietest ones. Not the ones made in anger, the ones made in calm understanding. Once that decision formed clearly in my mind, the tension I had been carrying for weeks quietly disappeared. Not because the situation had been resolved, but because I knew exactly how I intended to move forward. I closed the document, turned off the light above the dining table, and walked upstairs. The house looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but internally something had become very clear. I had chosen patience, and from that moment forward, everything I did would follow that choice. Once the decision was made, the most important thing was consistency. If patience was the path I had chosen, then everything that followed had to match that choice. No sudden reactions, no emotional confrontations, just careful steps taken quietly enough that no one felt threatened. From the outside, my life continued exactly as before. Daniel still left early for work most mornings, usually with a rushed goodbye and a coffee in his hand. I still went to the office, completed my reports, and returned home in the evenings to cook dinner. The rhythm of our marriage looked unchanged, but behind that rhythm, I began doing something small and deliberate. I started verifying information. One afternoon during my lunch break, I called the mortgage provider listed in our loan documents. I didn't frame the call as a complaint, and I certainly didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, I asked a simple, neutral question. How does the lender handle situations where a property title changes while the mortgage remains active? The representative on the phone answered calmly. Any modification to the legal ownership of a mortgaged property must be reviewed by the lender. If the borrower structure changes, or the title includes new parties, the bank may require a reassessment of the loan agreement. It wasn't surprising. It was exactly what the contract suggested. I thanked the representative for clarifying the policy and ended the call. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it confirmed something important. The structure I had identified in the documents wasn't theoretical. It was real. The second step was organization. Over the next several days, I gathered copies of every document connected to the house. The purchase agreement, the mortgage contract. The title registry update shows Lorraine's name added to the property. I placed them in a folder, arranged in chronological order. Not because I expected immediate consequences, but clarity matters when questions eventually arise. At home, Daniel continued discussing the house with the same relaxed confidence he had shown for months. "Mum thinks everything is finally sorted," he said one evening while scrolling through his phone. I nodded and set dinner plates on the table. That must make her feel better. Daniel smiled. "She likes having things organized." Again, that word appeared. Organized, but the structure behind that organization still depended on the mortgage contract, a contract that had never been adjusted. Daniel didn't seem to realize that, and I didn't rush to explain it. Because systems like banks and lenders don't move quickly. They move methodically. Registry updates eventually trigger routine reviews. Routine reviews eventually raise questions. Questions eventually require documentation. All I had done was make sure I understood the structure before that process began. A few evenings later, Daniel mentioned something else casually. "Mum's talking to a solicitor about finalizing the ownership structure," he said. I looked up. "Finalizing? Just paperwork," he replied. "Making sure everything's secure long term." I listened quietly. because the word finalizing suggested something important. Daniel and Lorraine believed the process was nearly complete. But from what I had read inside the mortgage agreement, the real process hadn't even started yet. And when it did start, it wouldn't depend on private conversations. It would depend on how the lender interpreted the structure of the loan. For now, though, nothing in our house looked different. Dinner still happened at the same time each evening. We still watched television together before bed. Daniel still believed the house ownership had been successfully arranged. And I continued living inside the calm routine everyone expected from me. The quiet one, the supportive one, the person who never complicates things unnecessarily. Which meant that while Daniel and Lorraine continued moving forward with their assumptions, they had no idea that the structure they were relying on had already begun approaching a system that required something very different. Alignment. And alignment always begins with questions. The first sign that something had shifted didn't arrive with urgency. There was no alarming phone call, no official notice marked immediate action required, no dramatic interruption of our daily routine. It arrived the way most institutional questions do, quietly. In the mail, the envelope came on a Tuesday afternoon, mixed in with the usual collection of letters, utility bills, a supermarket flyer, a charity request. I noticed the bank's logo immediately. Daniel happened to be home early that day. He was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open when I placed the stack of mail beside him. "Anything interesting?" he asked absent-mindedly. "Something from the mortgage provider," I said. He picked up the envelope and opened it without much concern. At first, his expression didn't change. He skimmed the first paragraph the same way he usually read financial correspondence, quickly, assuming it would confirm something routine. Then he slowed down. His eyes moved back to the beginning of the page. "What's that?" I asked gently. Daniel frowned slightly as he read the letter again. "They're asking about the property title," he said. His voice carried confusion rather than worry. Apparently, during a routine registry cross-check connected to the mortgage account, the bank had noticed that the ownership record of the property had been updated. Because the mortgage agreement was still active, the lender required clarification about how that change related to the existing borrower structure. In other words, they wanted to know why the property title now included another name. Daniel leaned back in his chair, reading the paragraph again. "That's strange," muttered. I watched him quietly. "Mum said everything had already been sorted," he added. The sentence wasn't defensive, just puzzled. From Daniel's perspective, the situation should have been simple. Lorraine had arranged the paperwork. The property registry had accepted the change. The house title now reflected the structure she had planned. So why would the bank care? But mortgages operate differently from family agreements. The bank had financed the house under a specific borrower structure. Daniel and me. Any change affecting the legal ownership of the property securing that loan requires explanation. Daniel placed the letter on the table and ran a hand through his hair. "They probably just want confirmation documents," he said after a moment. "Probably," I replied. Later that evening, he called Lorraine. I was in the living room when the conversation began. I couldn't hear everything she said on the other end of the phone, but Daniel's responses revealed enough. "They noticed the title change," he explained. A pause. "Well, yeah, the mortgage is still active." Another pause. "No, the letter just says they need clarification." His tone remained calm, but something subtle had entered the conversation. Uncertainty. Lorraine, from what I could tell, sounded equally confused. The solicitor's office that handled the title registration had never mentioned the lender needing to review the change, which meant something's important. The property registry had accepted the adjustment, but the lender, the entity that actually financed the house, had now noticed it. By the time Daniel ended the call, his confidence had faded slightly. "They just want a few documents," he said, almost reassuring himself. I nodded. Inside, I understood something Daniel hadn't realized yet. The process had begun. Not the private process Lorraine believed she had completed. The formal one. The one that exists inside contracts and lending structures. And those systems operate very differently from family decisions made at kitchen tables. Because once a lender starts asking questions about collateral structures, those questions eventually lead somewhere. And where they lead rarely depends on what people intended. They depend on what the contract actually says. At first, Daniel believed the bank's letter was simply a misunderstanding. Over the next few days, he and Lorraine tried to handle it the same way people often handle inconvenient paperwork, by assuming a quick explanation would resolve everything. But the bank's responses were precise. A second letter arrived requesting additional documentation about the title adjustment. This one referenced the mortgage clause requiring lender approval for any ownership change involving the secured property. Daniel read the letter twice. "I don't understand why they're making this complicated," he said quietly. Lorraine called several times that week. From what I overheard, she had contacted the solicitor who helped file the title change. The solicitor insisted the registry process had been completed correctly, which technically it had. But the registry and the mortgage lender were two separate authorities. One recorded ownership, the other controlled the loan attached to the property, and the loan still recognized the original borrower structure. One evening, Daniel sat at the dining table with both bank letters spread out in front of him. His earlier confidence had faded. "They're asking for a formal mortgage review," he said. That meant providing documentation about the title transfer and possibly restructuring the loan to match the new ownership arrangement. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mum thought moving the title would simplify everything," he murmured. I sat across from him, listening. Neither of them had expected the mortgage itself to demand clarification, but now, the situation had reached a point where the lender required answers, and those answers couldn't ignore one central fact. The loan attached to the house had been approved for two borrowers, Daniel and me. Without addressing that structure, nothing about the property could truly be finalized, which meant the plan Daniel and Lorraine believed had already been completed wasn't complete at all. And by the time they began realizing that, the process had already moved beyond private assumptions. It had entered the formal systems that operate strictly by contract, systems that don't easily reverse direction once they begin asking questions. The conversation happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Daniel had been sitting at the dining table for a long time, the bank letters spread neatly in front of him. Lorraine had called earlier, and it was clear from the tone of their conversation that the situation had become more complicated than anyone expected. When I walked into the kitchen with my coffee, he looked up at me differently than usual. More careful. "Harper," he said, tapping the papers lightly. "Can we talk about this?" I sat down across from him. "The bank says the mortgage can't stay the same if the title changed," he explained. "They're asking for a full review." I nodded. "That's standard," I said calmly. Daniel studied my face for a moment. "You're not surprised?" I didn't hesitate. "I read the mortgage agreement a few weeks ago." Silence settled briefly between us. "You knew this could happen?" he asked. "Yes." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "I should have talked to you about this earlier," he said. The statement wasn't dramatic. It sounded more like someone realizing a step had been missed. "We'll have to meet with the bank," he added. "Yes," I said. That was it. No raised voices, no accusations, just the quiet recognition that the structure of the situation had never been as simple as everyone assumed. And now it had to be addressed properly. In the weeks that followed, the situation slowly settled into something quieter than anyone might have expected. There were meetings with the bank, conversations with solicitors. Documents were reviewed more carefully than they had been the first time. Nothing dramatic, just reality catching up with assumptions. For the first time in years, Daniel began asking for my opinion before responding to financial paperwork connected to the house. Not with guilt, not with grand apologies, just with a kind of cautious respect that hadn't existed before. One evening, he slid a letter across the table and said, "Can you look this over with me?" I did, calmly, the same way I always had. But something inside our dynamic had changed. Not because I demanded recognition, simply because the situation had made something visible that had always been true. I understood the structure of these decisions. And now Daniel understood that too. There was no bitterness left in me by that point. Just clarity. For a long time, people around me believed I was quiet because I didn't see the bigger picture. But the truth was simpler. I had always been paying attention. The only difference now was that no one mistook my calm for absence anymore. Because sometimes the person speaking the least is the one who understands the situation most clearly. Looking back now, the most interesting part of this story was never the paperwork. It wasn't the bank letters, and it certainly wasn't the house. What stayed with me was something much quieter. For years, the people around me believed they understood my role. The calm one, the organized one, the person who kept everything running smoothly in the background. None of those things was wrong. They were simply incomplete. Because being quiet never meant I wasn't paying attention. And being patient never meant I didn't understand the decisions unfolding around me. In the end, nothing in this story required shouting, revenge, or humiliation. Reality simply reached a point where the facts had to be acknowledged. Contracts tend to do that. They don't care about assumptions or family expectations. They care about what was written. And sometimes, the person who reads the details is the one who understands the truth long before anyone else notices. So if there's one lesson I carried forward from all of this, it's this. Never assume that someone's silence means they don't see what's happening. Sometimes silence just means they're waiting for the right moment to let the facts speak. And now I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment where people underestimated you simply because you were calm or quiet?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.